So what you didn't see in the printed manual was our closer. But what you saw in the app when you downloaded it, it was that DMITRI ALPEROVITCH is our closer. He is the CTO and founder of CrowdStrike. Now, who's CrowdStrike? You heard from the president earlier in our program. But just to put frankly, they're the ones who identified the Russians as being responsible for the DNC hack. Is that correct, Dmitry? With that, who is DMITRI ALPEROVITCH to the rest of us? By Politico, he was selected as one of the most influential people during this election. So I'd like to say that we saved one of the best speakers available for you to close this out. And you know, when you have someone like Dmitry, you're kind of, you know what's coming next, right? Kind of nervous on how I'm going to introduce this one, but let's just say his talk is going to focus on a potential very touchy subject, and he has very close ties to that. He actually is of Russian descent. So knowing where to draw the line, Dmitry, you caught me flat-footed. I'm going to stop there. With the others, I did not stop. With you, I grant you the floor. So ladies and gentlemen, please, DMITRI ALPEROVITCH.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. So I have to say that when I got the call and they asked me to do the closing keynote for CyCon, I said sure. And then I thought for a second, well, should I tell them that my talk is not really about cyber? Let's go with it. So I'm going to talk about how to win elections and steps, sort of by step guide based on some of the experience that I've had in this election process. So can we, is there a clicker or something that I can use? Okay, at the lectern? Perfect. So let's talk about this. So I actually believe that fundamentally we very much misunderstand this domain, and thank you. And really, the Russians and to some extent Chinese and others get it very, very well. We tend to focus so much, and you heard in the last panel also, a great deal of talk about kinetic impacts of cyber. I actually don't believe that that's where the threat really lies. I believe fundamentally it's about information operations, influence operations, and we're seeing this play out really, really well in this election process. So a little bit about myself. You know, I'm a co-founder and chief technology officer at CrowdStrike. Prior to that, I was at McAfee, where I revealed a lot of the early sort of days of nation-state operations. And Politico did name me as one of their top 50 influencers in this election. They came up with a sketch of me. I'm not sure it quite looks like me, but I'll let you be the judge. So I'm going to start this quote with an interesting one. You may have seen some variations of this. This is an actual real quote from Mr. Joseph Stalin, said at a party congress in 1923, where he said, as you can see, that, you know, comrades, what I think in regards to this, and I can't do his accent, I'm sorry. I am Russian, not Georgian. But I consider it completely unimportant who in the party will vote or how. What is extraordinarily important is this: who will count the votes and how. And that philosophy is actually what I think very much influences Russian thinking on these types of topics and how they've approached the topic of elections, both inside Russia and in other places as well, as you'll see from this talk. So I'm actually going to go way back to the very beginning. A lot of people sort of think that this whole thing started with the KGB in the Soviet Union. It actually predates the Soviet Union. So there was an organization that was established in the 1860s in response to a lot of the anarchist political terror that we were seeing in Russia and later in the US and all over Europe. There was an attempted assassination on the Tsar in the 1860s. In response to this, the Tsar created one of the earliest intelligence organizations in Europe, and it was called the Ochranka, which roughly translates to defense. And that's actually one of the earliest pictures of some of the early officers that were part of Ochranka. And Ochranka was actually one of the most phenomenally successful intelligence organizations. They were unbelievably successful in infiltrating the anarchist movements, later the communist movements, and actually doing influence operations against these organizations. In the end, that wasn't, of course, enough, and we know how it ended in the revolution. But just to give you a sense of how successful they've been, in the early 1900s, the Pravda newspaper, which was the official newspaper of the then underground Communist Party, of course, later in the Soviet Union days, it became the official state organ. The editor, the chief editor of that newspaper at the time in the 1900s was an Ochranka agent. So they were able to put out their version of propaganda, cause dissent in the ranks of the Communist Party, cause a lot of debates and pit people against each other, introduce controversial positions through that channel. Joseph Stalin, we now know, was an Ochranka agent in the early 1900s and actually gave up a lot of his colleagues who were sent to Siberia. He managed to suppress that very, very well, of course, during his reign, but it all has come out since the fall of the Soviet Union. So you had this organization, this intelligence agency that was very successful in infiltrating the Communist Party. And then, of course, you have the 1917, the revolution occurs. Their offices get raided by the Bolsheviks, and they look in the archives and realize just how unbelievably successful that intelligence agency was in infiltrating their organization. And when they formed their first intelligence agency, which was called the Cheka, later renamed a bunch of times and ultimately ended up as a KGB in the Soviet days, and then, of course, renamed into FSB. And now there's talk that it's going to get renamed once again and sort of get back to its original size and mission scope. But they modeled a lot of their tradecraft, a lot of their operations on the Ochranka, knowing how those agents were operating. That wasn't the only intelligence agency they created. So they created, in 1918, the GRU. They realized that the Red Army, which was at the time battling a number of fronts, they were fighting the white forces, they were fighting the foreign invaders, and they needed their own intelligence organization, so they formed the GRU, which translates into Main Department of the General Staff, that has the responsibility for collecting intelligence on behalf of the Red Army. Of course, in the course of the Soviet days, the GRU's mission greatly expanded, and they were doing operations outside of the battlefield, and actually did illegal operations in the United States and Europe and various other places. And there was always a great deal of tension between the KGB and the GRU in the days of the Soviet Union. They hated each other. They were vying for power, budgets, typical things you would find in competing intelligence agencies. One other interesting thing that you have developing in the course of the Soviet Union was the Service A of the FSB, prior to that the KGB, which was responsible for something called active measures, or in Russian, disinformation. Essentially, operations designed to sow doubt in the minds of the adversaries. The Russians understood very well that it's not all about just defeating the enemy on the battlefield. It's not all about kinetic effects. You can actually win battles without even fighting them if you can actually psychologically defeat the enemy. And they developed really excellent tradecraft in that regard. So that was all Soviet Union days and the czars. Let's talk about recent Russian history. So you have the fall of the Soviet Union, the split of the intelligence agency, the FSB, took the foreign intelligence mission, the domestic intelligence mission, the SVR, took the foreign intelligence mission, and the GRU actually remained the same. In fact, the interesting fact about the GRU is that it's the only Russian intelligence agency that has kept its original name since 1918. But you have something that in Russian is called kompromat, or compromising information. Particularly in recent years, that has been very, very effectively used against opposition figures in Russia, and then is now being used in this election process and has been used all over Eastern Europe. So let me just set the stage. So this is 1999. President Yeltsin of Russia announces that he's going to be stepping down and nominates as a successor the acting President Putin. And in 2000, President Putin would run for the election. At the time, you also have the Attorney General, Igor Skuratov, sort of a strongman, law enforcement guy in power, went after some corruption, and he also announced that he was going to be running for president. So presenting some challenge, we don't quite know how it would have turned out, but potentially challenged to President Putin's chances of winning the election. So what happens? You have, right before the election in 1999, a video that is shown on every news media channel in Russia. And every single anchor describes that video as a sex tape shown on prime time in Russia. And it's a black and white video, a little bit grainy, hard to see, but every anchor says that we don't quite know who is in this tape, but it's a man that looks like the Attorney General. President Putin then goes on, I'm sorry, he's actually running still the FSB at the time. He goes up on television and says, the FSB is on the case. We're going to be investigating this tape very rigorously. We're putting our best experts on it, and we're going to figure out who exactly is on this tape. Very interesting mission for the Russian intelligence agency. Fast forward a couple of days later, he goes back on television and announces that the experts have investigated this tape very thoroughly, and indeed, this is the Attorney General. The Attorney General's career collapses. I think he achieved something like 1% of the vote. In the election, he is no longer a threat and has been completely discredited. So that was one of the earliest days in the modern Russian history that we have seen an influence operation against election and a discrediting of a particular opposition candidate. This repeated itself a number of times throughout the 2000s. And there was a particularly interesting incident where in 2010, a number of liberal opposition figures in Russia have been caught in a honey trap with a lady of the night named Katya, and they were videotaped on tape, having intimate relations with her and doing drugs. It was an interesting moment because, frankly, none of these figures at the time of 2010 actually even posed a remote threat to Vladimir Putin's hold on power. But it shows you that even then, he was still concerned, and the Russian intelligence services were heavily involved in operations to try to discredit candidates, even though they posed very, very little threat to them. This has continued on a number of times, and even this year, in April of this year, the former Prime Minister, Mikhail Kasyanov, who worked for Mr. Putin in the early 2000s, but then sort of broke off with him and tried to lead the opposition movement, he was caught in his house, recorded on secret camera, having an affair with his secretary. And this was a 1-hour-long documentary that was run on one of the major Russian news channels. So quite an interesting way to present news in Russia. This didn't just constrain itself to Russia. So in 2014, the French arrested a GRU operative, Colonel Lushin, in Paris, who was collecting personal compromising information on President Hollande. So in addition to building up a network of agents that would give him political information or military secrets of the French Republic, he was particularly interested in who Mr. Hollande was engaged with. Was he having an affair? A really peculiar interest for Russian intelligence. So then you start getting into the cyber realm. So in 2014, you have the announcement of a group called Cyber Berkut. This is right before the Crimean takeover. And this was a group that took its name from Berkut, which was the sort of the Spetsnaz team of the Ukrainian police who shot on the protesters in the Maidan in Kiev during the uprising there in February. So this group sort of modeled itself on we are the cyber version of Cyber Berkut. We're here to suppress the quote-unquote illegal coup that's taken place here. And this group has been involved in a number of really interesting operations that we'll talk about in a few minutes. 2016, I do want to mention the Lena affair, another attempt to get involved in electoral politics outside of Russia. For those of you who don't know, very interesting case in Germany earlier this year where a Russian immigrant, a 13-year-old girl, goes to the police and claims she's been brutally raped for a 24-hour period by migrants that have come over from Syria. And there's a huge uproar among the Russian immigrant community in Berlin. The Russian the Russia Today news channel picks this up. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, actually makes a huge case out of this with Angela Merkel and the German government. After an investigation, it has actually determined that the story is false and the girl was never raped. But nevertheless, it was an attempt to create political trouble for Angela Merkel and her policy of accepting migrants from Syria. So let's talk about direct influence in an election, because what we're seeing right now, this unprecedented campaign against us, has actually had its blueprints developed long before, a few years ago, in Ukraine. So first you have Vladimir Klitschko, the famous boxer, who is Ukrainian, and he was one of the candidates for presidency in the May election in 2014 in Ukraine. He ran on an anti-Russian platform, and the first thing that the Russians decided to do is to try to discredit him through, what else? Email leaks, something that has become very familiar to us in the course of this election. So in February of that year, a couple of months before the election, they hack into his party's email servers and leak out a bunch of correspondence. And the goal of that was really to show that he's a puppet of the West, a puppet of America. They were leaking out information about how he was talking to the State Department. In the end, it was quite innocuous conversations that you would expect people to have with the U.S. State Department, but nevertheless, it was very much presented in the Russian media as, here you have the U.S., the narrative is the U.S. Caused a coup in Ukraine and is now installing a puppet government that is anti-Russian on Russia's borders. The other objective of the information campaign in Russia was to also portray all these candidates as fascists, as Nazis. So you have a lot of imagery that emerged online, defacements with Nazi swastikas showing Ukraine as a fascist state. So May 2014, you have the presidential election. There are a couple of very interesting cyber intrusions that occurred during this time. So first of all, you had some DDoS attacks, a cyber coup launched against the Ukrainian election. To me, that's actually not very interesting. But the more interesting piece was actually, the TV just went out. The more interesting piece was the direct intrusion into the Ukrainian Election Commission. And there were a couple of things that were interesting. One, there was some destructive malware that attempts to actually impact the voting process and the aggregation of the counts from the different provinces in Ukraine. But then there was a direct attempt to actually change the website that showed the results, the total results of the votes. The fascinating thing is that the SBU, the main intelligence agency in Ukraine, which was sort of the successor of the KGB in Ukraine, actually managed to detect that attack early on, kick the adversaries out, and they never were able to change the website. Nevertheless, Russian television, Channel 1, the main television station in Russia, showed this screenshot purportedly coming from the Ukrainian Election Commission website. Mind you, this data never appeared on the election website. But what it is showing is that Petro Poroshenko, the ultimate president, did not win. He came in second. And the person that won is someone named DMITRI Yarosh, who is a very right-wing sort of neo-Nazi leader in the opposition and the leader of an organization called Right Sector, which is anti-Semitic and racist organization. So you had the television crew, the television station in Russia, showing this as the official result reported by the Ukrainian Election Commission, reinforcing the narratives that the fascists truly are running Ukraine. Again, the disinformation campaign in the cyber realm did not actually succeed. They never managed to put up this data on the election website, but that didn't stop them from giving it directly to the Russian television station to report as the official results of the election. Later that year, you have another election in Ukraine, this time the parliamentary election, another attempt to disrupt that. This time, the cyber coup not only goes after the election commission, but they also managed to successfully hack a number of electronic billboards all over Kiev and put out discrediting information on different candidates that were running in that election. Now, fast forward 2 years, 2016, we're in the very unprecedented election in many ways in this country. And let me walk you through that situation. So, summer 2015, Cozy Bear, an actor that we named at CrowdStrike, enters the DNC network. The Cozy Bear, the way we attributed the Cozy Bear actor is based on a number of things that they were using. A CDaddy Python-based backdoor. They were using particular PowerShell scripts and WMI persistence mechanisms we've only seen associated with Cozy Bear actors, as well as many other things I won't go into great detail. But this is an actor that we have seen before. This is an actor that last year hacked the White House networks, the State Department networks, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, among many others, and is probably one of the better, from a tradecraft perspective, actors we believe it's associated with the Russian Federation. April 2016, you have the registration of the DCLeaks.com website, which is going to play a pretty major role later on in the election. And I actually believe, in retrospect, that this was going to be the main outlet for all the leaks that were going to take place in this election. It didn't quite occur that way, and we at CrowdStrike kind of disrupted those plans, but I think that that was going to be sort of the WikiLeaks equivalent organization that the Russians had set up, so that they would create a narrative that this is just a bunch of American hackers that are trying to out the corruption and the collusion of elites in Washington to rig this election. I think at that time they did not want any fingerprints, any Russian fingerprints on this election, and they wanted to create sort of an entity that's very disassociated from the Russians. Later that month, you have the first intrusion from Fancy Bear actors, which we attribute to the GRU, into the DNC network. Again, use of a number of tools that we've seen exclusively used by Fancy Bear actors, X-Agent, external malware, among others. There were many other indicators that we affiliate with Fancy Bear. Again, I won't go into them all here. I laid them out on my blog in June, at least some of them. But we were very confident that Fancy Bear was the same actor that we had seen previously attacking the German Bundestag, previously attacking the TV5 channel in France, which was a pretty destructive attack against that media organization, and also has been involved for over 10 years in intrusion operations and traditional espionage against numerous NATO targets, defense departments, and other military organizations all over the European Union, as well as Ukraine, as well as Georgia, things of strategic interest to the Russian military. June 4th, before our publication, the DCLeaks.com website starts leaking information, and it starts with the emails, personal emails from a former NATO general that had just stepped down. Later on, you start seeing other personal communications leaked on that website from both sides of the political aisle, both Republicans and Democrats, although certainly a lot more on the Democrats as of late. During this time, we were called in by the DNC to investigate. We came in early May. We did a remediation of that network, which was completed on June 13th. And on June 14th, we publicly announced the breach and our attribution to the breach. We were asked by the DNC to do this. Usually when we do these types of intrusion investigations, we don't talk about them. Our clients never want to make this public. In this particular case, the DNC said, we want you guys to come out. We want you to publish your information. We want you to talk about the attribution because we think it's very important for the American public to know that Russia is trying to meddle in this election. So we did that. And at that point, I was still thinking, this is pretty standard. A political party getting hacked by the Russian intelligence is nothing surprising. This is the sort of thing that the U.S. government certainly would do against political parties overseas to get intelligence on what their platforms may be, the positions of different candidates, how that's going to affect our relations. Standard fare. Then something unprecedented happens. June 15th, the emergence of the Guccifer 2.0 persona on WordPress and Twitter, followed by multiple dumps of the DNC. Now, at the time of that emergence, I actually thought that perhaps the goal of creation of this Guccifer 2 persona was to discredit our attribution, to point the finger away from Russia, and I certainly think that was part of the goals. But clearly, as we started to see in the following leaks, continued information getting dumped, it became very, very clear to me that the ultimate goal was actually to discredit the election, and discrediting the attribution was just a small part of that. I actually think that the Guccifer 2.0 was not part of the original plan. It was clearly a very rushed job. A lot of people, including Dave Vitale and many others, did some phenomenal analysis following those leaks and showed the very poor tradecraft that the Russians had used with Cyrillic metadata in the documents, with creating this person as a Romanian sort of hacker, and when journalists actually started engaging him in Romanian, found out that he actually doesn't speak it but uses Google Translate. A lot of things that clearly were not well thought through, because I think the original goal was to use DC leaks ultimately to reveal this information. But once we came out and pointed the finger at Russia, they had to have a plausible alternative. They had to have someone who would come out and say, no, it's not Russia, it's me. And it was actually a very incredible claim on that first blog post, because what this Guccifer persona claimed is not only that they had hacked the DNC, but that they were the only ones that had hacked the DNC. And in all of my lifetime doing these intrusion investigations, I have never seen an intrusion group go into the network and then do a complete forensic investigation of that network to determine that they were the only ones that were ever in there. It just does not happen, right? And that was a very interesting claim to make that showed us that they were very much afraid of getting too tied to the this operation, and did not want people to think that it's actually Russia. Now, on June 27th, Guccifer 2.0 actually proves that he's connected to DC Leaks by giving private access to the back end of DC Leaks, a private protected access to the reporter. I think another operational mistake there. Once you set up these two separate entities, why try to connect them? But it was actually a pretty desperate time for them in the initial days of the leaks, because no one in the mainstream media was really paying attention. A few reporters were writing on it, but it wasn't getting major pickup. I was getting calls from reporters asking me about the source, and I said, well, there are documents on there. They're pretending to come from the DNC, and this person claims to be a Romanian hacker. We fundamentally believe it's a Russian disinformation campaign. And the reporters were saying to me that, well, if that's the case, we cannot trust the source. We're not going to report on these documents. But then, July 22nd, about a month later, everything changes once Guccifer, as he claimed on Twitter, provided the emails to WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks starts dumping them on the Friday before the Democratic Convention. Somehow, I don't know how the reporting business works in great detail, but if you can't report on it because Guccifer 2.0 is the source, I don't know why you would report on it when the source is WikiLeaks of the same ultimately information. But nevertheless, every outlet in the world started reporting on this without sort of any restraint. And I think ultimately they had to make a decision to go to WikiLeaks because their operations, both DC Leaks and Guccifer 2.0, just weren't getting enough credibility from the news media, and they had to find another outlet that clearly has had some success in engaging mainstream reporters. July 29th, I get a call from a Reuters reporter who tells me that he's had a tip that DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, has been hit. At the time, we were actually working on the DCCC investigation that called us in prior, and we discovered Fancy Bear actors in that network as well, and we're completing our remediation. So the DCCC made a decision at that point to acknowledge the breach, and shortly thereafter, Guccifer 2.0 starts leaking out information from DCCC. The most unprecedented thing in all of the leaks that we have seen up to this point, to me, occurred on August 12th. When the private cells and emails and addresses, home addresses of every Democratic House member were leaked by Guccifer. This was a spreadsheet that was in the DCCC network. And this, to me, raised this to a whole other level, because now you're not talking about private organizations like the DNC. You're not talking about private individuals. You're talking about official members of the U.S. government. And members of the legislative branch. And you're talking about impact to their personal safety, because that weekend I was on calls with the Sergeant of Arms and many congressional leaders. They were deploying police cars to many districts around the country because they're afraid that some crazies would use this information and try to harm elected members of Congress. All of them had to change their cell phone numbers because they were getting just the nastiest texts and phone calls on their personal phones. Many of them had changed their email addresses for the same reason. So that was a direct sort of, in my opinion, information attack on government officials in this country, which raises this to a whole new level. You had the shadow brokers leak on August 13th. Now, some folks, including Edward Snowden, believe that that was the Russians behind it. The timing is certainly very interesting. We're now seeing the investigation that perhaps it was an insider within the NSA. I don't have any personal information to indicate one way or another, but it's certainly been a very interesting summer. And then on August 15th, you had what I think is one of the most actually effective information campaigns ultimately against this election, where Guccifer 2.0 starts leaking very strategically. And this is not really well covered in the mainstream media because it's not that interesting. But what they're doing is actually reaching out to local papers in different districts, and specifically districts that are known as red to blue districts. In other words, House districts that the Democrats are trying to convert from Republican to Democrat in order to help them take over the House. And they're using the dossiers that DCCC had built up on their own candidates during the course of the primaries that included various negative information they had uncovered about those candidates to identify their weakness for party officials. They're using that to dump in those districts to the local media and to try to actually discredit those candidates and ultimately get them to lose. And I think that that will actually be one of the more effective things that they had done during the course of this election. The other thing that's been really fascinating is the hack into the World Anti-Doping Agency. We had attributed that hack also to our friends at Fancy Bear, GRU operatives. And in September, they started leaking that information, but yet they set up yet another website this time, and they actually called it fancybears.net, right? Adopting our own name that we had attributed to the Russians, attributed specifically to the GRU. And it's a remarkable shift in my mind because you went from June 14th, June 15th, a clear attempt to discredit the Russian ties and Russian fingerprints to this election, to now them sort of proudly letting us know that it is indeed the Russians, right? A pretty remarkable change, and I think a lot of it has been as a result of the fact that they saw no repercussions as they continued to escalate the leaks, as they continued to leak information on U.S. government officials. There was no response, and they just felt more and more emboldened as time went on. And ultimately, a fascinating interview was given by President Putin to Bloomberg. He said two things that really piqued my interest. One was widely covered, one was not. So he said, as the headlines reported, that does it even matter? Why is everyone focused on who did this? What's important here is the content. He's repeated that since then several times. But there was another line in that interview, and I actually watched it in the original Russian, that really piqued my interest even further. And it was towards the end of the interview, and he said, listen, this is not Russia. It can't be Russia, because whoever did it, they were so brilliant. They had their finger on the pulse of the American public. We're just not that good. We don't understand you that well. And he's smirking while he's saying this, right? So you can tell that he is particularly proud of this operation. I'm sure medals have already been given out to different operatives involved. And I think they have had a change of mindset where they're not going to publicly acknowledge that they've been responsible, but their attempts to deny it have been weaker and weaker. In fact, there was a remarkable interview that Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, gave to CNN just a couple of weeks ago, where he said, this came after the U.S. government's public attribution to Russia, where he said, well, we have not denied it, but the U.S. government also did not prove it. What do you mean you have not denied it? I mean, you have a foreign minister of a country that's saying we have not denied an attempt to influence this election. That is completely remarkable to me. So what is the ultimate goal of this? a lot of people have been saying, the ultimate goal of President Putin is to elect Mr. Trump and to discredit the candidacy of Mrs. Clinton. I'm actually of a different view. In terms of Mr. Putin's personal preference on who the president should be, I'll leave that speculation to others. But what I fundamentally believe is the objective of all of this. And this is, remember, a campaign that started a while back, long before it was clear who was going to be the nominee of either the Democratic or the Republican Party. But I believe the fundamental objective was to actually discredit the entire process and get people to think that the election is rigged and get people to think that you can't trust the result. In fact, I think it's a near certainty that either on the evening of November 8th or the morning of November 9th, unless there's some sort of action by U.S. government that perhaps deters this, there's going to be a discredited campaign that's going to be launched. It may be Guccifer, it may be Fancy Bears, it may be DC Leaks, who knows. But there's going to be information that's going to be put out saying voting machines in Miami-Dade County or Columbus, Ohio, you name it, have been hacked. You can't trust the result. Whoever's president is not really the president, regardless of any evidence of any hacks whatsoever. And in fact, it's been said many times, and I agree with it, that actually hacking the vote is very, very difficult. Many of these machines are not electronic. Even fewer of them, well, none of them actually are directly connected to the internet. So it would be very, very difficult to actually change the count. But you don't actually need to do that as long as you can produce some level of evidence that you've been in those networks. So one of the other things we have seen throughout this election is the intrusions and probing of different voter registration databases around the country. Now, those voter registration databases are actually public. Anyone can go and get them. The more interesting piece would be if you're inside those networks, is you're going to collect some materials, perhaps some emails, some internal documents that you can then dump publicly on the night of the election or the morning after in order to bolster your case that the vote has indeed been hacked. Never mind that voter registration databases are completely separate from the actual counting infrastructure. I think for a lot of the people whose candidate is going to lose in November, that's going to be enough to raise doubts and generate all kinds of conspiracy theories. And in fact, we're starting to see this play out in another realm where just a few weeks ago, Guccifer 2.0 claimed that he had hacked the Clinton Foundation and starts dumping documents claiming to be from the Clinton Foundation. Those documents are later proven not to have actually originated from the Clinton Foundation. A lot of them looked a lot like the documents from the DCCC. And in fact, the Clinton Foundation made a public statement that there's no indication they've been hacked. So already you have some discrediting, some manipulation of the data. Same thing occurred about a month prior where he had claimed that certain documents have come from a laptop that Nancy Pelosi was using at the DCCC. In fact, she had no laptop at the DCCC. And one of the more fascinating but less noticed leaks was actually the hack into the Soros Foundation. And those emails were dumped on DC Leaks. Now, you had simultaneous dump by Cyber Berkut of those same documents. And when people started comparing the two, and they should be identical, they noticed very slight modifications. So there was one Excel spreadsheet that was accounting for funding that Soros Foundation was providing to different organizations around the world. And in the one of the leaks, there was a line added for funds being given to Alexander Navalny, who is one of the main opposition figures in Russia. Again, very, very helpful to try to discredit this candidate as a tool of the West and as a pawn of the West. You're seeing sort of very slight modifications of the data in those dumps. Now, I'm going to wrap up here and take a few questions. I think we have a few minutes for questions, but I'll leave you with one final note, which is the final lessons in doing attribution. We do attribution based on a lot of the technical and other evidence that we're collecting in the course of those environments. We're very confident in our attribution to the GRU and the Cozy Bear actors we believe are affiliated with the FSB. The U.S. government has put out public statement acknowledging that the Russians have indeed infiltrated into those networks, and the DC Leaks and Guccifer 2.0 operations based on their independent analysis, which I'm sure includes a lot more information, including perhaps human sources and signal intelligence collection and other things that the government has capabilities to do that we don't, those hacks ultimately were driven from the highest levels of the U.S. government. But you also have other figures doing attribution in this domain. This election has been particularly fun to watch on the news, and on the Stephen Colbert show, you had some interesting attribution being done. I'll come back to this in a second, but he identified exactly who the Cozy Bear actors are, and then also the Fancy Bear actors. One last piece of sort of interesting trivia. If I can go back, my thing. Okay, there you go. We at CrowdStrike not only give kind of funny names to these actors, a little bit tongue-in-cheek of playing with them, but we also create occasionally T-shirts with those actors and create character animations. So I'll tell you a little bit of the story of why we called Fancy Bear Fancy Bear. And this is the actual T-shirt image. If anyone wants those T-shirts, unfortunately didn't bring them with me, but please contact me afterwards. We'll be happy to ship them over to you. So a little backstory. This is not well known, but we have a naming scheme at CrowdStrike. So it's an animal naming scheme. So anytime we're dealing with a nation-state actor from Russia, for example, you'll be called a bear. If it's China, it's a panda. If it's Iran, it's a kitten, Persian cat references, and so forth. And then the individual analyst that's investigating a particular intrusion and comes up on a new actor would give the first name to that actor, the first word to that actor. So the malware that Fancy Bear uses, one of the pieces of malware, is widely known in the antivirus community as Sophacy. And the analyst working that case had the song from Iggy Azalea, I'm So Fancy, on his mind when he was working that reverse engineering that malware. So Fancy Bear is the name that stuck. So when we created this T-shirt, we actually modeled it on Iggy Azalea. So you can actually find that image of her with her hands around her head. We made it into a bear. In fact, the funny story is one of our graphics guys was working on this. We were trying to get this T-shirt done for Black Hat. He was sending me different revisions, and I'm like, Matt, this just not look like a bear. And finally he gets frustrated. This is over the weekend. The deadline is about to pass. He's like, Dimitri, there's only so much I can do to make a tiny pop star look like a bear. So this is the image that turned out. A couple of funny things in here. So you can see Iggy actually has a bunch of tattoos on her arms. So we made sure to emulate that. The tattoo on her right arm here is the Russian spelling of the word aquarium, which is actually the nickname of the headquarters for the GRU. You can see the bear on her other arm and the GRU symbol on the hat. Anyway, a couple other things. Some of the inside story, I didn't go into a lot of details on the DNC, is actually going to be published tomorrow. Esquire magazine is doing a very detailed profile of our investigation, so I encourage you to go read that if you're interested. And if you're watching the show, the Circus, on Showtime, which is this reality show going behind the scenes of the election. I'm not sure who's watching because I think everyone's very sick of the election, but you may see a cameo of me on that show later tonight. Anyway, thank you very much, and I'll take a few questions if there are any. Yes.
Great presentation, Dimitri. Thank you. So what do we do about it?
That's the question of the day, isn't it? So I actually think that we have to look at this, and as we have to look at all of the cyber operations of consequence that we have seen as not cyber operations, but what is the ultimate effect? I think that one of the biggest successes, I think the biggest success we've had in this domain was actually last year when the Obama administration managed to get the Chinese to accept the premise that they will not conduct economic espionage against commercial targets. And the only reason we were able to do that is because we stopped thinking about it as cyber hacks and we started thinking of them as trade warfare against us. And we threatened to respond with financial sanctions, which got their attention in a heartbeat. And there's some fascinating stories around that negotiation, how the Chinese actually proposed that, with the US side being completely shocked that this would even be put on the table because they're so afraid that in the weeks leading up to the visit that this would be a slap in the face of China to slap them with financial sanctions. So the minute we stopped thinking of this as a cyber problem, we actually started to achieve effect and have achieved, in my opinion, one of the biggest successes we've ever seen in the cyber domain. I think in this particular case, this is not a cyber problem. This is an attempt by Russia to influence our election. That's how we need to start thinking about it. Now, what to do about this is even more complicated given our complex relationship with Russia. So I think whatever response we're going to do can't just look at the election, but is going to have to incorporate the response to Syria, a response to them putting nukes in Kaliningrad, a response to them shooting down a commercial aircraft over Ukraine, which is, I think, one of the most outrageous things they've done. I mean, even in the course of the Soviet Union, they've done an accidental shoot down of a commercial airliner, but they apologize for that. This is completely unprecedented. So I think whatever we do is going to have to be an all-out response to Russian aggression on many fronts, including military, diplomatic, financial, etc. But very hard problem, no doubt.
As a non-partisan question here, I think most people here probably agree that the Russians don't care about Democrats or Republicans. When's the shoe going to drop on the RNC, and if they hired you to look into their stuff to help protect them?
Well, we are nonpartisan as well, so I can tell you we are working with organizations on both sides of the aisle. I'm not going to out any of my clients due to confidentiality reasons, but I can tell you the Democrats are not the only ones getting hacked this election. Yes.
Dmitri, one of the big things over this weekend we've talked about is attribution, and your brief really hit home on this. So I'm curious, though, when it comes to attribution, as we take this very, very seriously, what process, what metrics do you use before you go public to say absolutely with a lot of confidence that this is the actor or it's not another nation-state actor?
Well, we actually have a very thorough process on this. We do run competing hypotheses when we do this. We look at the totality of evidence, and not only do we focus on the technical side, we have other sources that we'll look at. I'll just leave it there. So for us to make a public statement like this, we have to have a lot of confidence. I think so far we've been batting at 100, and hopefully we'll continue. Other questions? Oh, great. Well, yes. Final questions from Kim.
I just had a follow-up question because you talked about the response. What do you make of the government's sort of official, unofficial leak that it is going to respond to Russia? I mean, why telegraph that?
Yeah, so about a week ago, NBC broke this exclusive on a Friday that the U.S. is going to be engaged in covert response to Russia. I question how it's covert when it's on NBC, but I actually think some covert measures may be appropriate in response to this, but I do believe that there needs to be a very public response. And now that the U.S. government has come out, which I applaud them for, and revealed their attribution, you can't not respond publicly because the whole world is watching. And I've been contacted by a number of European governments who are actually very, very concerned because they're looking at this and they're saying, if you can do this to America, we're totally screwed over here, right? They're just going to walk all over us. So it's very important for allies. It's very important also for other adversaries that we face in this domain because they're watching as well, right? Do we want China? Do we want Iran? Do we want North Korea to be doing this to us? So a public response, whether it's actually even going to be effective or not against Russia, is irrelevant. Some public response that we're not going to take this sitting down is very, very important. Now, a covert response may be more effective in convincing Russia to actually stop this activity, but you need a public element to this, in my opinion. All right, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Dmitri, what a way to end this conference, leaving us all on our way very confident and assured that we got it all together and that we have really nothing to worry about. Thank you so much for that. So what a way to end the conference, huh?